Anglophobia, the unrecognized hatred, by Harry Richardson and Frank Salter. Introduction.
To be born white is to win the lottery of life. At least that's the conventional wisdom, and in many cases it rings true. White nations, and particularly Anglosphere nations like Australia, are the destination of choice for most of the world's would-be migrants. Their standard of living is the envy of most of the rest of the world. Added to that, they have advanced justice systems, the rule of law, free speech, low levels of corruption, and a welfare system which pays people simply for existing. Being white in a white nation is a double privilege, we are told. These countries were built by and for people like you. And yet, there are things, often small things, which are easy to ignore. And assuming that you aren't silly enough to break the unspoken rules, life can go on for the most part without ever really having to think about them too much. There are words you mustn't say, people you mustn't criticize, and policies you have to go along with, even if you don't really agree with them. Occasionally, these things can have more tangible effects. These can range from needing a higher score for university entrance to being passed over for a job or a promotion. For the really unfortunate, however, the reality of the situation can be nothing short of catastrophic. In the UK, thousands upon thousands of school-aged girls were taken as actual sex slaves by gangs of men who were mostly of Pakistani origin. When the parents of these poor wretches reported these monstrous crimes to the police, they were ignored or turned away because, racism. How can it be that the supposedly privileged majority can be treated with such utter contempt by the authorities who have a sworn duty to protect them, and claim to do so with an approach that is completely colourblind? Most of us are instinctively aware of the answer to this conundrum. The reality is that whilst racism is supposedly the greatest evil, the modern definition of racism is not what it appears to be. Racism is supposed to be discrimination against or hatred of people of a particular race or ethnicity. Yet the reality is that there is one race which is not at all protected by the anti-racism zealots. That race is the white race of people, who are increasingly discriminated against and defamed. This discrimination is committed by individuals, corporations, governments, media, including the ironically named social media, and more. In fact, the majority of the institutions of Western nations are increasingly hostile to Western interests and act as if the marginalization of white people and their history and culture would be a good thing. Why is this? How did it happen? Who or what were responsible for this disaster, and what can we do about it? One of the major tactics used by the radical left and their minority clients to gain power has been the weaponization of victimhood. In order to enforce and amplify this advantage, they have adopted or invented words to describe any discrimination or injustice against them. These words become powerful weapons when wielded by anti-Western radicals. These attack words have been used without restraint to advance the interests of these groups against the founding majority. White, and particularly Anglo culture, strongly discourages victimhood. Instead, it encourages self-determination and stoicism, encapsulated in the historic British concept of the stiff upper lip. Unfortunately, in the face of organised and well-funded minority victimhood strategies, Anglo-Stoicism has been a losing response. Whites need to recognise and identify injustices against them and against their group interests. They need to push back hard against these attacks. In order to do so, they need a word that encapsulates attacks upon them that are, or at least should be, unacceptable to most reasonable people. The word should not be clunky. It should roll off the tongue with ease. It also does not need to be strictly accurate. The term Semite is not exclusive to Jews, yet we all understand that anti-Semitism refers to hostility to Jews. After casting around and trying various combinations, we arrived, largely by process of elimination, at the term Anglophobia. We understand that the term Anglo may not resonate with many whites who are affected by this phenomenon. In North America, many may find it jarring due to having non-English ancestors, or due to the historic schism with Great Britain. Once the term becomes accepted and slides into the everyday lexicon, however, people will instinctively understand its meaning, even if they themselves might not identify specifically as Anglos. Once these minor obstacles have receded, the ease of pronunciation makes this the clear favourite, one reason why we have chosen it above all possible others, such as whiteophobia or the somewhat nihilistic blankophobia. The following book is the distillation of example after example of egregious Anglophobic behaviours. Whilst many of these examples occurred in Australia, there is no shortage of equal or greater injustices being perpetrated on an almost daily basis in other traditionally white nations around the world. This is far from a complete study, but we hope it will inspire an awakening and further research and examination by those who come after us.
Yet during the same period, discrimination against Anglos
Australian community.
Anglophobia, the unrecognized hatred, by Harry Richardson and Frank Salter.
In recent decades, the taboo against hostile discrimination has intensified. Racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and transphobia have been elevated to a point where they are now considered tantamount to criminal acts. Yet during the same period, discrimination against Anglos has been largely ignored. Note, in this document, the term Anglo refers to people descended from the indigenous population of the British Isles in Australia and overseas, as well as those who have assimilated into those populations. It can include kindred, ethnic, and cultural categories, namely people of European descent and Western civilization as a whole. This discrimination needs a name commensurate with its importance. We have chosen the term Anglophobia. A clear statement of the scope and type of Anglophobia has become necessary. Anglophobia is defined as hostility towards, aversion to, or discrimination against Anglo people. Anglophobia can be displayed by non-Anglos, by other white ethnicities, and by Anglos themselves. Hostility and suspicion toward Anglo and white Australians have become systemic within multicultural institutions. This hostility appears to be intensifying as ethno-religious diversity increases. It is harming Australians in general and Anglos in particular. If the other identity phobias are valid concepts for describing hostility towards particular groups, then so too is Anglophobia. Anglophobia helps to motivate policies which disadvantage the Anglo majority. These include unrestricted, large-scale immigration that is transforming our society. They also include assaults on the Anglo identity of children by the school system. Australians have never been asked to vote for these policies. Instead, they have been imposed by edict. Multiculturalism is a policy pursued by the governments of Anglosphere nations and many others in the West since the 1970s. The form of multiculturalism adopted is not the advertised normative type. Diversity and ethnic pride are not universally celebrated. Instead, the policies are often aggressive towards the founding ethnic group, acting like a form of cultural warfare intended to defeat Anglos demographically, economically, and psychologically. From its beginnings in the 1970s, Anglo advocates were excluded from multicultural forums and remained the prime targets of multicultural attacks on freedom of speech and association. This is intolerable in a law-governed democracy. If institutional Anglophobia is to be eliminated, it must first be put under the spotlight, examined and understood. The following list is not exhaustive, but it identifies and describes some of the more common categories of Anglophobia. The first category is
A. Vilification.
the most common form of Anglophobia is vilification, of which 7 types are identified here. These also include several subcategories. Anglophobic vilification is the assertion or implication that Anglos in Australia or elsewhere, unlike people of other races or ethnicities, 1. Are inherently evil. 2. Detract from but never enhance diversity. 3. Are responsible for any and all negative actions of members of their race throughout history because A. They engaged in colonialism, which was universally bad. B. Are responsible or owe reparations for slavery or other harmful practices carried out by other Anglo or white people before they were born. Therefore they, C. should have their children taught to believe that their own people, history, traditions and culture have transgressed the rights of non-European ethnic groups. A fourth type of Anglophobic vilification is to consider Anglos prone to racism according to the ideology of critical race theory, even when no direct evidence of racism exists. This means that they, A. are considered guilty of holding white supremacist beliefs for simply expressing or advocating on behalf of white or Anglo identity. B. Are uniquely culpable of racism due to their power over non-whites always and everywhere. And C. must be racist because they are on average wealthier, healthier, or better educated than some other racial or ethnic groups. A fifth type of Anglophobic vilification is to propose denying Anglos the freedom of speech required to promote or pursue the interests of their group, unlike other racial or ethnic groups. And A. Anglos should have their free speech right to express ethnic identity regulated by multicultural agencies such as the Human Rights Commission. And B. Anglos should have their expressions of ethnic or cultural pride, solidarity and identity blocked or removed from media platforms. A sixth type of Anglophobic vilification is to insist that Anglos not be allowed a homeland in which they may remain the majority. A seventh type of Anglophobic vilification is to assert that Anglos may have their cultural and religious traditions trivialized, denigrated, or eradicated.
B. Hostile discrimination.
The second form of Anglophobia is hostile discrimination. Anglo-Australians are routinely discriminated against in employment and promotion despite, or more likely because of, an elaborate system of so-called equal opportunity legislation and accompanying bureaucracies. The Equal Employment Opportunity and Affirmative Action regime is part of the multicultural establishment. It is designed and managed to benefit designated victim groups, which include various ethnic minorities, but excludes Anglo identity. Indeed, ethnic affirmative action amounts to jobs and promotions being taken from Anglos and given to others. Another important form of discrimination against Anglos is the use of the education system to indoctrinate school children. Anglo advocates have been ethnically cleansed from this and other institutions, including big tech and big social media.
C. Violence.
The third form of Anglophobia is violence. Unsurprisingly, vilification and discrimination are sometimes followed by violence. This consists of physical attacks against individuals motivated by hostility towards their Anglo identity. Types of violence include the sexual assault of Anglo women and girls based on their ethnicity. Those who excuse, ignore, trivialize, or cover up these crimes are also culpable. These types of Anglophobia are discussed in more detail presently. Before doing so, however, some general principles and key terms need to be defined. This book contains around 250 references and citations. These endnotes and other information may be found in the print or electronic versions of the book or at anglophobia.org.
Some general principles.
The meaning of Anglos has changed over the centuries. The name originates from the Angles, one of the Germanic peoples who settled in parts of the British Isles after the Romans evacuated around 450 AD. Anglo-Saxon became the collective term for these peoples, and also named their language with the term Anglo, transforming it into English. In Australia, the root word is retained in the term Anglo-Celtic, meaning the amalgam of English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish peoples, who constituted most of the white population from colonial times. In some countries, Anglo designates English-speaking white people. Thus, the meaning of Anglo has broadened, though perhaps less in the eyes of observers than among Anglos themselves. At the same time, the constituent identities remain, especially from the subjective perspective of those in the old country. A residue of past disputes remains in the memory of older Australians. Despite this history, the similarity of British Isles descended peoples is manifest. In this document, we adopt this broader meaning of Anglo. What does phobia mean? In psychology, a phobia is an extreme and involuntary fear reaction such as fear of heights or of being outdoors. The meaning includes the milder reaction of xenophobia, such as the aversion to strangers that begins at around 5 months in children. In politics, a broader meaning was in use by the early 20th century when Anglophobia designated hostility towards England or Britain. By late in the 20th century, the suffix phobia was being used to designate hostility towards many religious or sexual categories. Islamophobia, Judeophobia, homophobia, and transphobia are a few of the more common examples. Applications in the suffix continue to increase. Perhaps the earliest study of Anglophobia was by James Gwynne Cook, an American author who in 1919 wrote a book titled Anglophobia, an analysis of anti-British prejudice in the United States. Cook distinguished types of hostile reaction to Britain, all characterized, he thought, by ignorance or obsession with long-dead causes. This included Irish and German dislike of England. As early as the War of 1812, American Anglophobia emerged as fantasies about vast English conspiracies, though it was no fantasy when, in that year, the British Navy sailed up the Potomac River and burned Congress and the White House to the ground. Cook's thesis that dislike of Britain originated in real or imagined conflict suggests why Anglophobia was widespread a century ago. At its height around 1900, the British Empire ruled almost a quarter of the world's land surface and traded with much of the remainder. This vast enterprise brought subject peoples and many others into contact with Anglo administrators, soldiers, missionaries, traders, and, in what would become Anglosphere countries, settlers from Britain. In the present document, Anglophobia names something personal. It is the dislike or mistrust of British descended people wherever they reside around the world, though mostly in Anglophone countries. The new meaning usually applies within, not between countries. Also, the word and the sentiments it describes cannot usually be applied to the past. For example, Americans of 1812 could not have been Anglophobic in the ethnic sense unless they hated themselves, a phenomenon yet to arrive. This raises a question. If Cook was correct, then a degree of Anglophobia was understandable, if not excusable a century ago at the height of the British Empire. It is not a straightforward matter to explain why Anglophobia became more common after the British dismantled their empire, and why it is frequently evident among leftist Anglos within English-speaking societies, which show relatively high levels of openness and tolerance. The hostility towards Anglo-ethnicity and culture has been increasing since the 1960s. The term Anglophobia is not in common usage. Neither is it recognized by the multicultural establishment, which does not classify Anglos as a protected group. Most multicultural scholarship treats Anglos as perpetrators, not victims of prejudice. This is unfair because Anglos have for many years been subjected to vilification on a large scale. Consider the mainstream Australian media. Over the period 2012 to 2013, the second author of this paper documented 215 articles and TV programs touching on ethnicity and the national question. These were found in leading Australian newspapers and popular television and radio programs. Topics included Aborigines, refugees, racism, multiculturalism and diversity, national identity, foreign investment, international relations, and overseas ethnic conflict. 20 of these articles and programs ethnically defamed Anglos or whites, accusing them of smugness, hypocrisy and racism, fraud, idiotic conversation, having a special problem with racism, of detracting from diversity, and in particular of being too numerous in boardrooms among university faculty and in television programs, and adhering to offensive commemorations such as Australia Day and Anzac Day. No other ethnicity was defamed. Many of these accusations came from high-status individuals, including a race discrimination commissioner, television personalities, newspaper columnists, a retired judge, Jermaine Greer, university professors, Aboriginal leaders, and a serving foreign minister. The sample also revealed the mainstream media's acceptance of this defamation. No space was provided for counter-views. The media were biased and unself-critical. Anglophobia continues to trickle and sometimes gush into public culture. Biased news reports, documentaries and commentaries push negative images of white Australians using prestigious platforms such as SBS television and the voices of selected academics. Government-mandated school curricula and rituals are systematically Anglophobic, as detailed later in the text. In our definition of Anglophobia, we recognize that it is one manifestation of psychological propensities that are universal to human beings. We do not maintain that Anglos are purely victims and other groups only perpetrators. We are all humans and therefore capable of aggression and unfairness. Nevertheless, Anglophobia deserves attention because it is common in the media and in the educational system. In fact, hatred of Anglos is a core feature of multicultural ideology in Anglosphere societies. Anglos are the only ethnicity denied full participation in multicultural politics because the system was developed in opposition to their interests. Even a simple declaration of Anglo or white identity is liable to be attacked. This is not true for any other ethnic identity. As already noted, multiculturalism has the appearance of cultural warfare designed to harm Anglos demographically, economically, and psychologically. This ideology and its associated practices should be exposed in plain language and repudiated.
I'm an Englishman. I'm from Bermondsey, South East London. was called George. He was also from Bermondsey. His father, another Bermondsey man, was called George too. And his father, my great-grandfather, is from the same place. He was called Edward. These 3 generations of my family were in the fish trade. I'm the first member of my family not to work at the market in Billingsgate. My great-grandfather had 11 brothers and sisters. They all married, except one. They had 43 children. Of these, 37 married. And between them they had a further 159 children. One of those was my father. I don't know exactly how many of his generation married or exactly how many children they produced. I've so far tracked over 200 of them. Many still live in Bermondsey. Some are still in the fish trade. There are 7 called George and 5 called Victoria. I stand here in front of you as a representative of all of them. And I ask in their name the great question put by our patron, Mr. Powell. What do they know of England, who only England know? Or what can my family, who come from England, who lived in England, who know only England, say of this, our country? Mr. Powell once spoke of the destruction of ancient Athens and the miraculous survival in the blackened ruins of that city of the sacred olive tree, the symbol of Greece, their country. And he also spoke of us, the English, at the heart of a vanished empire, seeming to find within ourselves, like one of our own oak trees, the sap rising from our ancient roots. And he said, perhaps after all, we, who have inhabited this island fortress for an unbroken 1,000 years, brought up, as he said, within the sound of English birdsong, under the English oak, in the English meadow, beneath the red cross of St. George. It is us who know most of England. And I appreciated him for saying that, because it was as if he spoke for my family, who understand well their own country, who understand even better their own capital, London town, as we used to call her. As we strolled in her parks, as we marvelled at her palaces, as we did business in the city, went west for a dance, took a boat on the river. The pale ale and eel pie of old London. The London of my family, for as many generations as I know. The London that within 15 years would be less than 50% white. London where in 15 years a white person will be in the minority. Am I racist? No. Do I have anything against people of other races? No. Would I prevent them from coming into my home? No. So what then is my gripe? My gripe. And I speak on behalf of 7 men called George and 5 women called Victoria. My gripe is quite simple. My gripe is that we were never asked. My gripe is that we were told for themselves. And now they are the class that is giving England away. They have never asked us, and they never will. Do we allow them to sell our heritage? Or is it time for us to speak? To speak. To refuse them the right to give away our holy, our bountiful, our only England that has nurtured us naked, grown us as the oak. Is it time for us that England know to come yet again and defend our country with our fire, our fists? Is it time for our sons to rise again